And let me tell you just a bit about Cindy. She has a great background. As I mentioned, she's a certified ADHD coach, and she specializes specifically in parenting topics. She's the creator of an unusual series of workshops for parents called Calm and Connected. These workshops are really terrific. You can find her website, PTS, Pathways to Success, ptscoaching.com. And on them, you'll see registration for the next 7-session workshop series that she's launching beginning March 1. Her workshops are offered nationwide via webinar, or also if you're in the New York area in person. So again, let me mention her new book, 8 Keys to Parenting Children with ADHD.
Okay. Well, I think, Susan, you gave a great intro to my bio, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over that and get right to the meat of what we're going to talk about, which is these kids. And I'm sure many of you looking at this screen right now are saying, oh, that's my son. I know that boy, right? And this is something that he might say. My son won't try anything he can't do right away with ease. I tell him all the time he's so smart, he could do anything, but it doesn't work. And so often I find loving, well-meaning parents and teachers, by the way, because I do go into schools and do teacher trainings as well. We mean well when we say, come on, you could do it, you're so smart, you've got this. But somehow that's not working. So what we're going to look at today is to see, well, why isn't that working, and maybe what else can we do? The challenges to learning are what we really need to look at, because kids sometimes lack motivation. There we go. And kids sometimes avoid a challenge. And sometimes kids break down when things get hard. And by the way, adults too, right? So what we're going to want to look at is, what can we do to help kids want to learn? Now, normally at this point, I would be showing you all a video. And unfortunately, I'm not able to show the actual live video, so I'm going to kind of walk you through it. Imagine these two people that you see right here are going up the escalator, no problem, and all of a sudden that escalator just stops. And what happens when it stops is very interesting. They stop too. They just stand there. They stand there and they look around, and if you can see the expression on the gentleman's face, he's saying, oh no, we've got a problem. And then the two of them just stand there and they start yelling for help. They're just saying, is anyone out there? Can anyone help us? There are two people stuck on an escalator. What are we going to do? And we all sit there and we watch this and we laugh. But the reality is, this is what happens to so many kids. You might have the kid who comes up to you and says, you know, Mommy, my pencil broke. And you look at them and they say, and you say, yeah? Now what? The problem is, and by the way, you can get the actual video afterwards, and if you can advance the slide for me, Jordan, perhaps. You can get the video of this afterwards by just Googling on YouTube, stuck on an escalator. What happens is, before learning can happen, one must believe that they have the ability to learn. You have to believe you have a chance to learn, just like you have to believe you have a chance to solve your problem. I always kid around and I say, very often when that box from IKEA comes, or one of the furniture companies that we have to build the furniture, very often one person takes the instructions and just gives it to the other person and says, oh, I don't build, I can't do that. Jordan, can you advance that slide? Thank you. To the next one, please. So what happens is, a student's response to a challenge arises from his or her beliefs about their intelligence. Carol Dweck, and some of you may be familiar with her work, Carol Dweck did some work with a typical 7th grade middle school class, and she gave them a puzzle. What she did was she took the kids out of the classroom one at a time so that they weren't around their peers, and gave them a puzzle to do that was pretty much in their wheelhouse, something that they were able to accomplish. And based on completing that puzzle, one of two responses were given to that student. And the first response was, you must be smart at this. You must be smart at this. And when we say this to a kid, what we're really doing is we're praising them for their intelligence. As a result of this, it's very interesting. Kids focus on looking smart. When they were given another puzzle to do, and remember they're not around their peers, when they were given another puzzle to do, they really just focused on their success, on looking smart. And also, what happened was, as the puzzles became more difficult, they showed lower levels of confidence, motivation, and performance. Now, why would their performance go down? And I usually ask this, I do this as a full training for both parents and for educators and therapists. And when I ask the question, a lot of people think that the performance goes down because, maybe they are embarrassed or they don't know what to do. But in reality, the performance starts going down very often because they just don't keep trying. They don't persevere. They give up. Because they've convinced themselves that if I can do it, that means I'm smart, therefore the opposite occurs. If I can't do it, I'm not smart, therefore what's the point? And interestingly, when they went back into their classroom and their peers asked them, well, how'd you do on that? They were more likely to lie about how they did. Because remember, their peers didn't see them, so they didn't want to look like they weren't smart. So they said, oh, that puzzle was easy. I did it, no problem. Okay? Also, what happened was they became more risk averse. As the puzzles became more challenging, and then they were offered, would you like to do a puzzle like these challenging ones or maybe one like you've just done? They didn't want to choose the more challenging puzzles. And of course, why would they? Well, now we have the other kids. And for these other kids, instead of being told, you are so smart at this, they were told, you must have really worked hard. So in fact, these kids, what we're doing is we are praising them for their effort. We're praising them for their effort. And as a result, these kids focused on learning the task. So when they were given more puzzles to do, they focused on learning the task. And in fact, as the puzzles became more challenging and as they did more puzzles, their level of confidence, motivation, and performance actually increased. Now, why would their performance increase? Were they any more intelligent than the first group? Of course not. Their performance increased because they kept trying. They didn't give up. They were being praised for effort, and that's so important. So these kids, when they were given the choice between a more challenging puzzle or one like they've just done, they were more willing to try the more difficult task. They were willing to try the new ones and the more difficult ones. Okay? So this brings us to the importance of mindset. The importance of mindset. What Carol Dweck and her researchers found was that she found that there really were two different kinds of mindsets, either a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And in a fixed mindset, you believe that your intelligence and your expertise are based on fixed, unchangeable traits and abilities. Some people are smart, some people are not. I'm good at math, I'm not good at English. I can't do foreign languages, right? These are the stories we tell ourselves, the things we say in our heads. And for these people with a fixed mindset, what happens is they view effort as fruitless. I mean, what's the point of trying? Because either you get it or you don't. You avoid a challenge, you give up easily, and that self-talk, the things you tell yourself, those are all negative. I can't do this. I give up. I'm never going to succeed at this. And they view criticism and the success of others as judgment. And it's actually threatening. Oh, that kid got a 90 on a test and I got a 70. They must think they're so smart. I'm not as smart as them. They must think I'm not smart either. But then when you have a growth mindset, what happens is you believe that your intelligence and your expertise can be developed through effort and instruction. You have a desire to learn, and you recognize that brain and talent, those are just the starting points. It's effort that's the way to get to mastery. And not just effort, by the way. It's very important that we note here, it's not just effort, because we can't just say, oh, come on, keep trying. It's also having the proper strategies and having access to support and a safe environment with someone that they feel they can learn with. These are all very important. So these are the kids who embrace a challenge, they persevere, and they use motivating self-talk. The things they tell themselves are, oh, come on, you could do this. I've done this kind of thing before. Don't give up. You can do it. And they view criticism and the lessons of others as actually inspirational. Oh, you got a 90? I only got a 70. How did you do that? What strategies did you use? So we want to see, okay, great. Well, we've got these two kinds of mindsets. How are we going to impact our mindset? Well, there's three basic things you need to do. The first thing is we need to teach kids how learning happens, because in fact, kids don't necessarily know how learning happens. And then we're going to want to create a growth mindset culture in the home and at school. And we are, of course, going to want to help kids believe that they can learn. So let's look at what we need to teach our kids about the brain, because it's really very simple, and I would encourage each of you to experiment with your own best way. I'm going to show you a slide. I got this slide right off the internet, okay? And this is the brain. And what you have, where you see it says prefrontal cortex, those of you who are familiar with the executive functioning, okay, your executive functions are in the front part of your brain, and your executive functions are really the thinking part of the brain. That's the space for mental control. That's where you do what you intend to do. Things like initiation, planning, organizing, activation, self-talk, emotional regulation. These are all working memory. These are all our executive functions. So that's the front part of the brain. Then we have the hippocampus, that's in the limbic system. And I know that it's not in the middle of the brain, but I always tell kids, think about where you want that learning to go. You want it to go right in the middle of your brain. You want it to stay there, somehow stick there. So the hippocampus, that's where you link new sensory input to form, store, and process memories. And then, of course, we have the amygdala. And the amygdala, that's involved with the experiencing of emotions, okay? And that's the back part of the brain. We think of that as that's the last part of the brain, the first part of the brain to develop. That's the primitive part of the brain. The other thing we want to let our kids know is that the brains have neuroplasticity. And that's a funny word. It doesn't mean our brains have plastic in them. But what it means is our brains change physically when we learn new things and when we have new experiences. And every time you learn something new, your brain forms new connections. What happens is the information comes into the cell body, and you can see that cell A and cell B. So it comes in via the dendrites, okay? And then it goes out via the axons, and it goes across that synapse from A to B and B to A, okay, via neurotransmitters, the dopamine and the norepinephrine, in fact. Those of you who are familiar with what ADHD is, right? It's the below normal transmission. But at any rate, what happens when you learn is the more you practice something, the more you review it, the stronger those neuron connections become. So you can do some great activities with kids, either at home or in school, where you have them actually make a cell out of pipe cleaners. And you can use a bunch of pipe cleaners, and the information comes in through the one end of the pipe cleaner, it goes out through another end, and you can have two of these cells together, and you can put string in between the two cells. And every time they repeat something, they add a string. So let's say they were learning their math facts. Okay? Every time they repeat it, they'd add a string, and you would see that what happens is the more they practice, the more strings there are, the stronger that connection becomes. That's your neuron connection. And the expression is the neurons that fire together wire together. So the more you do it, the more they wire together and become strong. So the weaker connections are pruned away, as we do with plants and trees. So basically, use it or lose it. To talk a little bit more about Carol Dweck's research, which was fascinating, this is what she found. She took her 7th grade kids, and she split them into 2 groups now. And half of the kids, she gave some math study skills before a test. The other half of the kids, she gave the same study skills, but also a 10-minute lesson or 20-minute lesson in the brain and how learning happens. And the results were fascinating. What happened was, Carol Dweck's research found that those who had explicitly had training in a growth mindset and a basic education about the brain, they showed significantly greater improvement academically when compared to those students who just learned study skills. And why did that happen? Well, here's her quote. Many of the students reported using the image of their neurons making new connections to motivate themselves in school, saying that they pictured their neurons forming new connections when they paid attention in class, and when they were tempted to not study, they rejected that idea on the grounds that the new connections would not be formed. So guys, we just gave kids a reason to study. We just gave them a reason to study. And in fact, what they learn is that your brain is your most important muscle. The more you use it, the stronger the neuron connections become. Now, normally at this point, I would show a video, but I'll just tell you about the video and tell you where you can go get it. And it's going to be about Michael Jordan and LeBron James. The video, if you want to find it on YouTube, or if you can't find it, and by the way, if I don't get to anyone's questions or you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me afterwards. My email address is cindy@ptscoaching.com, and I'll show that at the end as well. But the video shows LeBron James talking at the beginning, and he says basically, well, you know, what should I do? I didn't make these championships. You know, what am I supposed to do? Should I sell my shoes? You know, is it my fault really? And then Michael Jordan comes on and he talks about, well, maybe it's my fault. Maybe you didn't realize how hard this all was for me. How my expertise did not come from just playing basketball. I was out there all the time. I practiced every day and every night. And in fact, the truth is, Michael Jordan did not make it onto his high school basketball team. In fact, the legend is that he went home and cried. But he had such a strong growth mindset that he never gave up. And it wasn't just that he believed he could, he did everything to succeed. In fact, here's a famous quote from him. I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot, and I missed. I failed over and over and over in my life, and that is why I succeed. Now, wait a minute. I failed, and that's why I succeed? Yeah, because he learned from his mistakes. He didn't give up. In fact, many people know that after Michael Jordan played basketball, he actually went on and played baseball. He played professional baseball, I think, for a few years. And he was known to be the first one out there in the morning and the last one to leave. He practiced over and over. And then, by the way, he went back and won 3 championships again in basketball, which is pretty remarkable. There's a book out, by the way, by the author is Malcolm Gladwell, and the book is called The Outliers. There's a chapter in that book called 10,000 Hours. And what he found was it takes 10,000 hours to develop mastery. He looked and he researched about the Beatles, and we all think of the Beatles as this overnight success, but in reality, the Beatles played over and over and over again. Same thing with Bill Gates and Steve Wozniak. When they were learning coding, they did this all the time. It didn't just happen to be an overnight success, and the kids really need to understand this. They need to see the amount of practice that goes in. In fact, if you ever want to show them a great example of a growth mindset, watch Dancing with the Stars. Even if you just watch the first episode and the last episode, and you see these are people that started out with no skill in dancing, and yet through the instruction, the perseverance, and everything else, they then become these wonderful dancers at the end. What we want kids to learn is that failure, well, that's just data. Okay, failure is just data. It tells you where you need to learn, it tells you where you need to strengthen your neuron connections, and it tells you where you need different strategies. Because even in failure, we still have to have an opportunity to succeed if we're going to maintain our resiliency and our grit. So I was, this past week I was in Orlando at the LDA conference, that's the Learning Disabilities Association conference, and I did a whole full presentation on developing grit and perseverance in kids. And one of the things we talked about with this growth mindset is we actually have to set kids up, let them know, you know what, we're going to give you an experience where we are going to test your limits today. We're going to test your determination and your patience. I really expect that you are going to fail. I'm going to push you to the point where you will not fail. And don't worry, there's no grades here. It doesn't matter how you do. Everyone's going to do differently. We're going to try some different activities. And if you email me, I can make some suggestions of different activities you can do with the kids. But our goal is to help kids face the frustration, because by helping kids safely experience struggle and frustration, we can help them become aware of their self-talk and challenge that self-talk if necessary. Because here's what we see as some of their self-talk. If we see the kid on the left, he's the one that's saying, he's got the fixed mindset, of course we now know. Oh, I'm not good at this. This is too hard. She's so smart. I'll never be that smart. Right? All those negative talk that gets us giving up. But look at this girl. She's saying to herself, I can do this. I'm going to use a strategy. Or she might even say, I need some help to figure this out. I can't do this on my own. Now, there are wonderful resources online right now. If you were to Google growth mindset and growth mindset statements, I'm going to show you a few. Let's see. On the left, what we have, if I can get there, are some, and I apologize, the slide got a little distorted, but these are some fixed mindsets. I'm not good at this. I'm awesome at this. Now, that sounds like a great statement, but that's actually a fixed statement too, right? Because if you're saying I'm awesome, that's almost like an end point. But here's some suggestions on some positive things that they can say instead. So instead of I'm not good at this, you might say, well, what am I missing? Instead of I'm awesome at this, it might be I'm on the right track. Instead of I give up, you might say I'll use some strategies that we learned. Or instead of it's too hard, well, this may take some time and some effort. I can't make this any better. Well, how about I can always improve somehow, so I'll keep trying. Or the kid that says I just can't do math, well, I'm going to train my brain to do math. And there are wonderful resources out there. I know a lot of kids, math is a very big issue. There are some wonderful resources out there to help kids get over their math phobia, and adults too, I might add. Or for the kid that says, I made a mistake, how about mistakes help me learn better? She's so smart, I'll never be that smart. How about I'm going to figure out how she does what she does so I can try? Don't be scared to ask her how she did it. Or it's not good, it's good enough. How about is this really my best work? And of course, if plan A didn't work, well, the answer is time for a new plan. Right? So the other thing I want to really point out here is stress and the impact of stress on learning. What we have in this image on the right is our typical brain. And if you see that circle there, it says the chief executive officer. That's your prefrontal cortex. Those are your executive functions. And what we know is that when stress comes in, the negative emotions increase the hormone cortisol, which dulls cognition. So the prefrontal cortex turns off, and the reflexive and rapid responses of the amygdala turn on. At this point, the brain goes into survival mode. What does the brain look like in survival mode? Well, fight, flight, or freeze. Now, I've done this workshop so many times I can imagine your faces as you're sitting at home saying, yeah, that's my kid. Yeah, that's when we get into big battles, or that's when he just leaves the room, or that's when he just puts his head down on the desk and says, I give up. Because what stress does to the brain is it shuts it down and it goes into that survival mode. So in fact, no learning can take place, no problems can be solved, and empathy for others, that becomes very, very, very difficult. So I want to wrap this up because I'm going to want to have plenty of time for questions, but I have a few more things I really want to talk about, which is what is your own mindset? Because we all do this, and we mean well. In response to the child who did poorly on the first math quiz of the year, the very well-meaning teacher or the very well-meaning parent says, oh, don't worry, Johnny, not everyone can be good at math. But then if you think about it, how much is Johnny really going to try after that? I mean, what's the point of trying? Not everyone can be good at math. But a growth mindset, in this case, you would say, you know what? I know you can do better. Let's see what happened. Let's see how you can prepare differently next time. And then we're going to set out to do that. Because what Carol Dweck found in her work is, in terms of grades, When we emphasize effort, that gives a child a variable they can control. They come to see themselves as in control of their success. But when we emphasize natural intelligence, that takes it out of the child's control, and it provides no good recipe for responding to failure. So when we think about those grades, we've got to come out with a lot more creative ways to grade kids, like maybe grading them on their effort, grading them on the number of tries they had, or the plan that they made, or their organization, all of these things that get to the executive function skills that we're always trying to build. And in terms of how we talk to our kids, we've got to praise a lot, but we've got to praise with impact. It's not enough to just say good job. We've got to be specific. So the formula I do with parents is notice, name, and nourish. Notice what your child's doing and or feeling when they're feeling something positive. Name what you notice and the value in what you see. And then nourish your child with warmth. Appreciate them in the moment. So here are just some examples, and I don't expect everyone to be this verbose, but I just want to give you a full example. Jared, I see you working really hard at that math problem. I notice you tried a few times without quitting. That shows me you don't give up easily. Good for you. Or you might say, Sarah, I think you're trying really hard, but I think maybe the strategies you're using, or maybe the strategies I'm teaching, aren't really working for you. Help the kids really see what their own mindset is. Challenge them, but let them know you're challenging them. Let them know, you know what? Let's see what happens when you get frustrated. This is a safe place to do it. Let's try. All right. That ends, I guess, the formal part of my presentation. I know we're going to have some questions, so I'm open to hearing whatever questions you may have.
Hey, Cindy, that was really fascinating. I love the idea of the growth mindset. Could you talk a bit more about strategies for parents to use to encourage their children to develop that mindset? I thought those quotes that you just gave were very helpful, and I wonder if there are any other specific tips that you would have for parents to help them.
Absolutely.
And there's also some issues about maybe if you want to address teens specifically as well.
Well, you have some ideas for that, huh? Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah.
No, I know okay. That's a hard issue. Absolutely. Well, let's talk general first. A
couple of people have said, can you change a child's mindset by the time they're in high school? So it's sort of what does a parent do to really change? We've all dealt with the kid who just gives up. It's just really
that kid that we had right at the beginning of the PowerPoint.
Right.
Exactly. And it's funny you specifically are starting right off with the teens. I will get to that, but in the presentation I gave yesterday at the conference in Orlando, that was one of the teacher's questions. She was a high school teacher, and she said, well, what do I do with these high school kids?
Yeah, right.
Right? And the answer really is the same, but slightly different, just like it is with all parenting issues when you have a teenager. Let's back up a second, though, and go to the first part of the question is what can parents do at home? Well, one of the things I recommend is playing some games with them where it's not win or lose, it's just expansion. In other words, one of the great things you could do in there, and as I said, I'm happy to email anyone the specific resources I have, or you might find some online. Take out some toothpicks. And there are a bunch of puzzles you can do with toothpicks where you lay out the toothpicks. I wish I had a slide I could just visually show you, but lay out you lay out the toothpicks in boxes, let's say. And the challenge is if you remove 3 of the toothpicks, can you create 2 boxes instead of the 4 that you already have, or the 3 that you already have? So if you can visualize that, there are some structured activities you can do with toothpicks where you're setting them up, and then the goal is to take away some and create a different image. And in doing this, starting off really small with some easy puzzles, and then building up to some harder ones, the question then becomes, well, what was your thinking process while you were doing this? When you started doing this, how did you feel as you approached it? And the kid might say, oh, I thought I could do this, no problem, right? Or they may say, oh, I'm not good at these puzzles. And then you want to have that conversation. You want to do it side by side with them. And then as they're doing the puzzles, then you may say, well, how are you feeling now? What strategies are you using? What strategies do you think you can use? And then after they do the puzzles, you can talk to them about, well, what did you learn about yourself? How did you deal with the frustration? Because we want to give them those experiences so they know how they deal. In addition to the toothpick puzzles, there are rebus games you can play where they're word puzzles. You want to try to do a variety of different activities because for some kids, they're going to get frustrated really quickly if you do the toothpicks. Some kids are going to love those. They love puzzles like that. So you want to stretch them. You want to go, whether it's linguistic puzzles or any of the different kinds of games. That's why board games in and of themselves, I mean, these kids are so attached to these videos and the video games. Take out some of those regular old board games and see what happens. There's the game Jenga, and that might be a great one to play with the older kids because, it's so much more strategy involved in that. Pulling out the pieces and putting them on top. With the older kids, you're going to have the more real conversations, Susan. You're going to say, hey, you know what? It seems like, I get it. This is really hard, and I see you giving up. Let's talk about, times in your childhood where you really overcame, whether it was learning how to ride a bicycle. Remember, and you tell your kids these stories. You remember when you were learning how to ride a bicycle, or you remember when you really wanted to play baseball, or you remember when we got this new video game, or we got this, new setting, or remember the time that I got frustrated and you taught me how to do it, right? So we want to make this whole subject very real for them.
Were you going to add anything about teens or?
Well, in terms of the teens, I guess what I'm saying here is you got to be even more real in terms of noticing where, you got to notice where you see that they get stuck, and talk to them about it and say, hey, you know what, you're such a good kid, and I see you're getting stuck here. I want you to feel like when you hit that world, you're not going to get thrown, right? So let's talk about how you're coping when you're getting struck. Let's see what you could do differently. And that's when I say remind them of times when they've had that experience. Remind them of that growth experience. One of the examples I always give when I'm teaching is, and I know you all can't see me now, but I'm not the world's greatest athlete. But when I was in my late 40s, I decided to do an endurance bicycle ride. I'd never really ridden more than 4 miles in my life. But I signed up for something called right? And I signed up for something called Team in Training, and we raised money for Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and I signed up for a 100-mile bike ride, right? Pretty insane. But what happened was when I went the first week and we were doing the training, and they were already up to 35 miles, and I thought, oh, I'm not doing 35 miles. I'll just do the best I can. But the coach with me said, don't worry about the miles. I'll keep track of the miles. You just look at the next tree. You just look at the next, light pole, and you just keep going. And as we rode, she kept giving me encouragement, and she kept giving me strategies, and she stayed with me. And at the end of the day, I had done my 35 miles, which is pretty amazing. And so when you talk about the teenagers, well, the story I had always told myself was I can't be an athlete. After all, both my parents, who I'm happy to say are still alive and in their 80s, when they were both very heavy smokers when I was growing up. So I thought, I can't be an athlete. I have no lung capacity, that secondhand smoke, the whole bit. So my entire life was never much of an athlete until I challenged that story I told myself. And I found that I could do it. And I'm happy to say I have now done 6 century rides. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So you think that it was the coach staying with you and giving you strategies as you went along? Does that apply to parents? Should they stay with their child while they're trying to work through something? I mean, one of the questions here, for example, is what do I do when my child shuts down and gives up? What do I do in that moment? How do I get my child who's stuck to get unstuck?
Well, any parent that's ever taken my workshop or read my book knows this. When there's stress or anxiety in the room, no learning takes place. So in that moment may not be the teachable moment, even though we think that is. So in that moment, I may just comfort my kid and say, hey, I see it. You're getting frustrated. Don't worry, kiddo. We're going to figure this out. And then just let it go. Maybe, play a game. Maybe go away from it and come back to it another time. But at a totally separate time when there is no stress, That's when you do this wonderful teaching. That's when you have these conversations. Hey, you know what, I noticed back there, or I noticed yesterday you got stuck. You're going to come up with things like this again. Let's talk about, like, what can you do next time? Like, what are some ways I can help you, or what are some resources you have?
Okay. So Aaron says, building Legos is my son's favorite when he's mad. What is the thing I can do while he's building? Is that a time to reinforce this message?
Well, okay, so let me make sure I understand the question.
Yeah,
so
I'm not sure I do either, because she says he's building Legos is his favorite thing to do when he's mad. So
I think I have an idea of what she's talking about. I think what she's wondering is, if he's angry and he's building Legos, is this going to be a good time that I can have this conversation with him? Well, without being there with her, I'm gonna give two different answers. How's that? I'll cover both bases. If it seems like as he's playing, he is calming down and he is receptive, and he's engaged in his Legos, that might be a great time to just throw a lot of that positive praise in there. Hey, wow, look at that. You know, that I saw you putting that piece on and then you changed your mind. You really handled that well. Or that fell down. I noticed you picked it back up. So notice him in the moment dealing with his frustration and praise that. If it seems like he's using this simply as a way to calm himself down and he's kind of shutting you out, then I would say let him be. And don't let that be the teachable moment.
Okay. Here's a question from Holly. This sounds like a tough situation. She said, faced with repeating 6th grade, how do I get my son's mindset to finish out the year as best as possible? And how can I tell him that repeating 6th grade isn't the end of the world?
That's so hard. That really is hard. Yeah. I mean, and honestly, the first thing we need to do is really be real with the kid and empathize that, you know what, this is hard, and I get it. Let's see what we're going to do to make this really positive. Let's see what we're going to do to take the best of it, because it is an opportunity, and I am sorry this is happening. Let's see, what are we going to take away from 6th grade? What are the goals that you want to set? You know, some of the research that's come out about goal setting is really very encouraging, because what we see is when we help kids actually set a goal, not a goal of I'm going to get an A, but a goal of something that they are attached to, that they can improve, that they can have some control over. And then we help them set a plan to reach that goal. This reduces stress and anxiety, and it improves tenacity and grit. So maybe it's about saying, okay, you know what? Let's see what we're taking away from this year. Let's see what it is that we're going to do to make sure next year is even more successful.
So offer to come up with a plan with him, with a child. That's interesting.
That, and also, of course, empathize and don't say, oh, it's not so bad. And I'm not saying the mom is saying that at all. I'm really not.
No.
But you want to be real.
Don't diminish it. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Boy, some great questions here. Let me just pick one. What can I do with my child who's a perfectionist? She gets so frustrated with herself when she has a hard time with schoolwork, and she completely refuses to continue. It really seems that she's anxious over failing. I bet that's a good insight.
Yeah. Well, again, the first thing I would say is, in the moment, it's probably not the right time to teach the lesson of what to do when you're a perfectionist. So we're going to want to address this when it's not that moment, when it's maybe, way after the fact. After sometimes is better than before, believe it or not. Learning from the experience rather than anticipating the future experience. But one of the things you do with that is, first of all, model in your own life. Like, for instance, I always tell teachers, I'm sure that there were times when you made a lesson plan to teach something and you ripped it up. One of the things you could do is tell your class, you know what, I came up with a plan. I realized that wasn't going to work for this reason, and therefore I made the change. But for the perfectionist, the one that can't really let go, sometimes we have to talk about good enough behavior. In other words, before we even start kids are notorious for wanting to spend all that time on the cover sheet and not get to the essay, right?
Right.
Right? So talk beforehand about, you know what, I know if you had 5 days to do this cover, you can come up, you're an amazing person with this, you can come up with the perfect cover. But the reality is, time is like money, right? It's limited. So you're not gonna have enough time to spend on, just the cover. Let's talk about how can you get it to good enough for now, and then if you have time later on, you can come back to it. But so in other words, you're planning with them in advance. Listen, I know you'd love it to be perfect, but that's not going to be, it's just not going to be achievable, not in the time and resources you have, right? So what's going to be good enough, and then if you can come back and get it even better. So what you're doing is you're bonding with that part of the child that and he knows that maybe he can get it perfect in a perfect world, but that's not real. So work from there.
That's an interesting way to approach perfectionism. Sort of say, this is good enough for now, let's move on, kind of, yeah. Oh, here's another sad one. Oh, Barbara, my son wakes up and says, he's in the 5th grade, another stressful day in school is ahead. How do you deal with someone who has, made up his mind to have such a pessimistic view of his school life?
Yeah, and you know what? I feel for these kids because unfortunately the reality is that for some of these kids it really is another stressful day. And one of the things you could do is talk from, again, your own experience. Yeah, you know what? I have a lot of stress too, or maybe talk about some executives or whoever else that deals with a lot of stress, and let them know, you know what? The challenge is how you deal with stress. That stress is sometimes going to be a reality in your life. Let's look at what your resources are to deal with this. And that's when you can talk to them about gratitude, that it's so important. Again, I always like to lean on the science. The science has shown us that if we can come up with 2 or 3 gratitude statements every day, it can relieve our stress. We can talk to this kid about what do you do in terms of your breathing, right? Help him learn mindfulness, help him do meditation, help him learn where the stress is in his body, and what can you do. In other words, what I guess my overriding message is, accept the reality that, yeah, you know what, there's going to be stress. Let's figure out how you're going to deal with it. And then the other piece is I would show him a graphic similar to what I put up there in terms of stress. Talk to them about how, you know what, when you're feeling that stress, what's happening is the front part of your brain is shutting down, that thinking part of your brain, and you're going, you're not able to think as much, you're not able to solve your problems. So I get it, you're stressed out, but if we can help you get less stress, you're going to see the day's going to go easier, and you're not going to need that stress because you're going to stay in the game more.
I think the stress issue can't be overstated, really. We've had a couple of speakers who've been very articulate on the way, the stress that kids with learning disabilities and attention disabilities live with, and how that affects their mindset, their attitude, everything. It's really a hard one. And on the stress question, Francis asked, when teens are stressed due to something they cannot control, what are some skills they can learn to help them go into a growth mindset?
Well, you said the sentence right there, that they can't control it. So really it's about, again, away from the moment, what do you do when you can't control things? What are your coping strategies? What are the mantras you say to yourself? Right? What are the things you can tell yourself? In other words, when I'm in a situation where, look, I'd love to control my whole life, and I can't. I can't control the traffic. I can't control, the way the person's going to respond to me. I just have to know that I am doing what my integrity tells me I have to do, and then I'm doing my best. I can control, we cannot control other people's behavior. We can only control our own. So it's asking for help when you can, and it's accepting, what you know you can do, and that you are doing your best.
Here's an interesting subject by someone whose child has an auditory processing deficit. Many of the strategies that you've given us, wonderful strategies, involve talking to your child. And she's asking, since language impacts every area of learning, how do I encourage my child with a processing and language deficit?
That's a
It's a tough
beautiful
one.
question.
Yeah.
Beautiful question. I would say certainly, and I'm sure, I'm sure if this is something you've been dealing with before, you know that there are so many different graphics, anything from the simple graphic of, the different faces, the different emojis, right, to things like an effort graphic. I have on one of my other PowerPoints, it's a thermometer. And at the bottom of the thermometer, that's where, you're shut down, you're not really trying, you're giving up. And then as you go up the thermometer a little bit, you're trying a little harder and you're asking some strategies. And then as you go up the thermometer, you can see you're adding more and more. And then at the top of the thermometer, you're feeling great. You did what you could. You tried your hardest. You did your best. So that's one of the things I would say is try to use some of those graphics. Ask them to visualize, when was that time when you felt like you were on top of the mountain, where you were just looking out over everything and you felt like I'm the king of the hill, I'm the top, I succeeded. And what was that feeling you had? And how can you visualize yourself up there on that mountain? And what did you do to get there?
Yeah. A couple of the people who were on the webinar have kids who are facing critical or hostile teaching environments they feel. So Jacqueline says, how do you get your child in the mindset to learn in school when the teacher seems to be the enemy? She's critical. She calls him out for not being focused, for not being on task, and takes away his recess almost daily. And another person says, my teen struggles in school. Teachers are really frustrated with him. His grades result in him being benched, so the coaches are really frustrated with him. How can we help the coaches and the teachers understand that their anger and frustration is making matters worse? So 2 kids who seem to be one more teen, one more elementary, both facing what they perceive as a fairly non-supportive learning environment.
Yeah, well, as you know, Susan, part of my passion is really teaching teachers, and I empathize because, I go into schools, I do professional development, and sometimes I have those teachers in my audience, and I know it.
Really?
I know it right at the beginning. In fact, I've had teachers even say to me at the beginning, my job is to teach, their job is to learn. I'm not worried about if they like me, I'm worried about that they're there and they're learning. And the first thing I know is, not happening, because I know if there's no connection with that teacher, it's not happening. And so what I do through the beginning of the workshop, it's really very interesting what happens. I really try to have them have the experience of the child so that some shifting goes on, so that they understand. So the thing I would say to these parents is, try, and I know this is not easy, and this is why it's a lot easier to have someone come in from the outside and do the teacher training, but try if you can to, whether it's a one-page handout, and I've got some of those things, on my website, by the way, I've got plenty of articles. You're welcome to print those up. But educating the teachers. Understand that teachers, in their education, they may be the best teachers. They did not learn about ADHD. They did not learn about executive functioning. And when I say they didn't learn, I mean they didn't really learn beyond just, maybe a basic introduction. They didn't learn about the brain, all the things I was telling you about. These are things that wasn't necessarily part of their learning. So for many of them, they welcome this information. They really do. They start to look at the kids differently. So if we can help them understand mindset and maybe make suggestions to them, and I know a lot of you are sitting out there and saying, oh, my teacher's not going to listen to it. Then sometimes what you need to do is you need to call the meeting with the teacher and the guidance counselor, because very often the guidance counselor will be more receptive to this kind of learning. So you can start to infiltrate. I would also have, I go into schools all the time and do parent presentations, and I know when I'm doing a parent presentation in the evening, very often there are administrators there. So bring someone in to do a parent presentation. If you've got a PTA or a PTO, or in New York, a lot of our schools have something called SEPTA, Special Education PTA. And we go in and we talk and we do a lot of education, because that's where this starts. We need to shift the teacher's mindset.
Okay, yeah. There's a couple of questions from teachers here that are interesting. So not all teachers, a lot of teachers want to help. This is one who's...
I know, absolutely. They really do.
Teacher. Yeah, they really do. I'm a teacher of a 5-year-old, and I have a student who shows such anxiety that as soon as I ask the children to come up with an idea, he's a bright, capable child. He immediately says, I can't do that. I'm going to fail. He bursts into tears no matter how many times we show him that he just needs to try.
Oh,
yeah.
I get that. Here's one thing I would suggest, especially when you've got these little kids, like, you can play along with them. Talk to him in advance and say, you know what, Johnny, we're going to be doing a lesson on this, and I know you're really good at this stuff. Do me a favor. When I ask everybody, do you want to prepare something in advance that you can do, and then maybe you can show it to everybody? And so when I call on people, you can be ready with this. So what you're doing is you're setting this kid up in advance for success.
That's a great idea.
Kind of breaking down, because you've got to break down that anxiety. You've got to realize that some of the anxiety comes from, raising his hand, hearing his voice in the world, or seeing it, being the last one. Maybe he has a slower processing speed, whatever it is. So break down the steps, have him have the success in it, one-on-one with you, and then encourage him to share it. And then afterwards, you can even privately, so you're not embarrassing him, say, hey, wow, you did that great. I know sometimes when we're doing it in a whole group, you feel like you can't do it. Let's you and I have some signals with each other. Let's you and I, plan something so you can start to realize you really can, and then work from there.
So I literally build successful events for this child. So
exactly.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great suggestion. Here's an interesting response from another teacher who says, when anxiety is a problem, if you step back whenever the student is stressed or anxious and you let them avoid the discomfort, aren't you then starting this process of getting used to earlier and earlier and avoiding addressing the issues? Isn't it may not be appropriate to try to push them to fail so that they experience what it means to stay engaged?
Yeah,
when things are hard.
Yeah, logic would say to do that.
Right.
Yeah, logic would say to do that, but here's why that doesn't work. Because what we're doing is we're not giving the kid the skill.
Right, right.
We need to build the skill. So the way we're going to do that is by strategizing with them, is by collaborating with them. So I'll give you basically my definition of enabling versus supporting, because I think that's really what the teacher's talking about. Am I supporting this or am I enabling, right? My definition of enabling is when you do for someone else without a plan to help them learn to do it for themselves. So that's the piece that we need to make sure. In other words, if I'm helping, if maybe in the moment the right thing to do is let this kid avoid the situation because he's just, remember, without calm there is no learning. He can't learn right now. But if I afterwards, in a safe space, I help him plan for that same experience, then I'm not just helping him deal with frustration. I'm helping him, then I am helping him deal with frustration. I'm not helping him learn to just avoid it.
Right, right. That's a great suggestion. So that's a wonderful, that question of enabling versus
supporting
comes up all the time in our webinars. I think it's something that all parents wrestle with constantly. So that's a really helpful distinction. Supporting is helping your child have a plan for dealing with whatever it is, as opposed to just doing it for them or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly.
Let's see. We're dealing with OCD and ADHD, and it seems like my son's anxiety stress level is just always on. What you say about learning and stress makes so much sense. How do I get through to my child because I feel that he's stressed because of the OCD? That's from Olga. That sounds like a tough situation.
So you think the stress is from the OCD? Well, the OCD is an anxiety disorder. Right?
Right.
So one thing I would say, and I know medication is another whole issue, but if it's warranted, medication may help. But again, pills never teach skills. They just make it easier, to be able to learn. So I think one of the things we do is we get so stuck on these teachable moments, we don't realize that the teachable moment isn't that moment. So again, I'm just going to say the same thing. Just back it off from then. Help him, role play those frustrating situations when we're not really having them.
Yeah. Okay, that's really, yeah, that's super important. How to figure out when the teachable moment is, when your child is open to it, as opposed to in the moment of stress or meltdown. That's a big insight, I think, too. Julie's asking a good question, I think. How do we talk to our kids about accepting and welcoming support, like tutors or ADHD coaches? And forcing support doesn't work very well, of course. And of course, many kids are afraid of having support because they're afraid they'll fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so not easy, I know, because people call me for coaches all the time, and I've got wonderful ADHD coaches I can recommend, but the first thing I have to do is assess, is the kid coachable, right? Is he really ready for support? And that's why I became a parent coach, to be honest, because what I find is very often when kids aren't ready for coaching, there's a lot the parent could do, a lot more than they realize they could do. And some of it is in shifting the conversations they have with their kid and the expectations they have with their kid.
Right.
And so that I don't have a quick one or two liner for that. I would just say that sometimes we need to back off and realize that we need to work with them differently so that we can help them become coachable.
Yeah, that's great.